who are here with us tonight. This program is sponsored by the Westboro Historical Society, which has its headquarters just down the street on 13 Parkman Street, where there are 3 rooms of artifacts for 3 centuries. And the Westboro Historical Society's mission basically is to promote and preserve the rich heritage of Westboro. And it does that by tours of the William Sibley House, bus tours, and actually teaching the local history to the elementary schools. So therefore, Westboro history is alive and well in Westboro, and one of the ways that we keep it alive and well is to present various historical programs. And one of the things we wanted to tell you about, so you will note in your calendar, is there are 2 things coming up. One, in Saturday, January 25th, there's going to be a winter bazaar at the Sibley House from 9 to 1 with all kinds of collectibles, one-of-a-kind items, treasures, jewelry, prints, all kinds of neat things that you just have to come and discover for yourself. So that's Saturday, January 25th from 9 to 1. And if you have some donations for us to sell, you can bring them in on January 16, this Thursday, from 2 to 4. Also, another program coming up is one on February 3rd, and that is Monday at 7 p.m. at Tatnick, and that will be why we remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911, which was a devastating industrial fire in which 146 women, mostly immigrants, were killed, burned, because management had locked the doors. And that fire was very important in starting off women's rights and labor rights, and a very important incident. And so we will learn about that on February 3rd. But what we have tonight, you will find out 3 turning points that changed American history. And we've been wondering what those points are. And everybody has different bets on what in the world they can be. And we're very lucky to have Professor Edward O'Donnell from the College of the Holy Cross. He is chairman of the history department at Holy Cross and an expert in Irish American history and the Gilded Age. He also is host of a podcast in the Past Lane that deals with different topics of American history. He has written several books, one of which is 101 Things Everyone Should Know About Irish American History, and the other is Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality. And we're very lucky to have him tonight so we can find out what those 3 points are that changed American history. And we hope you come and visit the Historical Society as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an awesome crowd for a rainy, drizzly, sleety Monday night. So we do have one empty seat down here if anybody really wants to get up close to see my amazing political cartoons and such. But anyway, thank you very much. We've done this a few times in different locations, and also this is a fun talk to give. I give this talk all the time all across the country for an organization that some of you may know about called One Day University. So if you haven't looked up One Day University, you are One Day University people, and they pay $150 each. So you're getting it for free. So there's usually two or three other, like there's a psychologist comes on and first and does the psychology of happiness, and then the historian comes on and does 3 turning points in American history, and then a political scientist comes on and says, what does Putin want? They're sort of live TED Talks essentially. So they're pretty cool. All right, so 3 turning points. Why don't we just jump right in, okay? So this is a nice tight room. What constitutes a historical turning point? Well, I should say that in addition to working for One Day University, I also have done a couple of great courses. So one called 48 Turning Points in American History, which I always joke about, since we're only doing 3 tonight, that we could make it an entire weekend if we wanted to. So I had to pick, which 3 were I think are the most important, or arguably the most important, most consequential ones. So that's what we're going to be working with. But when you sit down to think about what they are, the list is endless as to what constitutes a turning point. And some of them, World War, dropping the atomic bomb, it's an enormous turning point. But the curing of polio or something is consequential, but in a different kind of way. And some turning points, like 9/11, is bam, right away. And then other ones, it's more of a slow, incremental development over time. So just keep that in mind as we do this. So the first turning point, and some of these turning points are going to be, none of them will surprise you in terms of what they're about, if you look like a pretty interested history audience. So it's my job to take what might seem obvious and to explain in good detail and all to why it's so consequential. So the first one up is the Declaration of Independence, which might not surprise all that many people, July 1776. But there's lots of stuff in the Declaration of Independence that we forget about or we never knew about. And then there's also, much more importantly, the long history that's still happening about the Declaration of Independence. So let's jump right to it. So just quick little background on it. They write, these 3 guys, Franklin, Jefferson, and John Adams, are tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's the main writer. The other guys are sort of his editors. And if you know anything about Thomas Jefferson, you know that he does not like to be edited at all. His words are perfect and everything else. There's a little bit of a tense relationship. But we can clearly see that the editing worked well. Some of the most notable phrases were tweaked by particularly Ben Franklin. So this was the original phrase. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. We have a seat right down here. All right, and the edited version, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Changing it. Franklin said it sounds a little too churchy. Hey, we're in the Enlightenment. This is so. Let's rephrase that. So now, what does the Declaration of Independence declare? The most important thing about it is there's 2 parts to it, right? There's that first third, that's all that wonderful Enlightenment language about we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, and so forth. And then there's the business section, which is about 2/3 of the document. Nobody remembers anything about that, but that's all that mattered. The flowery introduction and invocation of natural law and all, that's really just decoration for the document. And what's happened though over time is we totally don't care about the last 2/3. We really just care about the Enlightenment language in that first third. So the Declaration of Independence was essentially a press release. That's really what it is. It's a press release about declaring war. So it's a very business-like document, sort of laying out why we're doing this radical thing, breaking away from the mother country, declaring our independence. It's radical. You have to explain yourself to the world, and that's why all the business section, those 2/3 part, all of it begins with the same 2 words. He has, he has, he has. He is King George III, who has violated their rights, and therefore, since he's trampled their rights, they now, the colonists, have the right, as they see it, to overthrow that corrupt and cruel leadership and establish their own government. So. That's the key thing to keep in mind, that it's much more business-like. Nobody clamored to write the Declaration of Independence. In some ways, Jefferson and Franklin and Adams got kind of stuck with doing it, while the guys who thought they were far more important were arguing other things and preparing for war. So the significance of the Declaration of Independence, there's a couple key details that we should focus on. One is that it declares that all men are created equal. We think we know what that means, but that is a radical statement. That even with tremendous radical potential down the road that Jefferson would not have ever anticipated, that it would be applied to men, applied to people of color, they'd be applied to women, that it would be applied to virtually every caste of human being. He did not think that was the case. But even in its own day, it's a radical declaration to say all white men are created equal. I mean, that's not what everybody believes. That's a bold statement. A second point is democracy, right? It says governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers not from God or a person who calls himself the king, but from the governed. The people are the ones, that's the sole and legitimate source of authority are the people. That is, I mean, capital R radical stuff for that era. Things we take for granted. A third point, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That rights are not gifts from a queen or a king, because gifts can be retracted, right? If you behave badly, you lose freedom of the press, or you lose the right to a jury trial. And Jefferson and the others are saying, no. These rights exist like the laws of gravity. A king can violate them, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. So this is the idea that our rights are part of the natural order. They come from God, they come from the Creator, they come from the universe, whatever word you want to use, and that gives them that much more power and really kind of nullifies the claims on authority by monarchs. And then, finally, and this is my favorite part, which is the line, perhaps the line we all know best, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I highlight among these because they're the two least interesting words in the whole document, but they think about it for a moment, what the power of those two words are. Jefferson is saying there are innumerable rights. We in the late 18th century won't know what they might be in 50 years. We don't know what they are even in our own time. We have to live our lives and build our society and figure out what these things are, so that there are three very vague categories there: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson and the others are saying there are innumerable rights out there, and we're not going to try to write them all down. You just have to find them. And so it gives us license, gives us permission into the future to say, to figure out what these are. And eventually we're going to figure out that one of the among these is the right to vote, which is not stipulated anywhere that everybody gets a vote, even that all white men got a right to vote. We established that about 40 years after the Declaration, about 40 years after the Constitution, that all white men would get the right to vote. That's not, that's a new idea that kind of came to us, and we decided that was a right. That's just scratching the surface. All right, so and then I should point out this last point about there being innumerable rights does make its way into the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment, it basically says all the rights that we lay out in the Constitution, they're not the only ones. So there are lots of others out there. So if we didn't say it specifically, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it's a very, very important point we know there are people that call themselves originalists, who say that the Constitution should just be the Constitution and it just should say what it says. That's a lovely idea. It's utterly and completely divorced from all reality, and it's a great convenient way of saying the Constitution says what I want it to say. So all the founders are on record as saying this is in so many words, an evolutionary document, and one that we're going to have to use and apply differently in different times and different places, and figure out what these things mean in our own time. All right, now, this is how we do it, right? So we take the long-term significance of the Declaration of Independence is really what makes it powerful. It was a not particularly important business document in 1776, but over the decades, Americans take it and use it for their own purposes. And again, they focus on that first third. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 1848, she decides to hold a women's rights convention in upstate New York at Seneca Falls, and very cleverly, very brilliantly, lays out the case for women's rights by using the template of the Declaration of Independence. So it begins, we hold these truths, when in the course of human events, et cetera, and uses that language, and the most notable phrase is just that all men and women are created equal. So she tweaks the document to give heft to these wild, crazy claims that women should have equality and the right to vote. And what do you imagine the business section? She rewrites the business section too. And it continues to say he has, but it's men. He has refused us the right to divorce. He has refused us custody of our children. He has refused us the right to get educated, to work. There's 40 or so things that are laid out, the case against men's abuse of women's natural rights. Okay, and decades later, this same idea of changing the Declaration is carried forward into the early 20th century. So here's a women's rights advocate, and she's tweaking the Declaration of Independence, and look who's looking on, none other than the ghost of Thomas Jefferson, and he's not furious, right? John Jefferson is saying, I never thought of that. Jefferson's the guy with that great, expansive, Enlightenment mind, and they're making the claim that if Jefferson was alive in 1915, when this drawing was made, he'd be in favor of women's rights and women's rights to vote. So it's a very powerful document, way more powerful than Jefferson would have imagined. he definitely wouldn't have imagined this, which is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison, starting in the early 1830s here in Massachusetts, leading the great charge against slavery as the leading abolitionist. And Garrison said at one point, like, where does this? Why is he an abolitionist? He's asked all the time. Why are you such a troublemaker? Why are you, fomenting civil war? And he says, I'm a believer in that portion of the Declaration of Independence, and goes on to, cite it. And then at the end, he said, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Hence, I am an abolitionist. That's the Declaration of Independence to abolitionists it's an abolitionist document, without question, because it says all men are created equal. Slavery violates that. Abolitionism gets its authority from it. African Americans, at the very same time, this also happens in I don't know, I think this is in Massachusetts, certainly New England Colored Citizens Convention, very common thing to do. These are free African Americans just before the Civil War, and they are laying out the case. They're doing two things. One is they're saying to the people that want to, who are advocating freeing African Americans and then shipping them to Africa, they're saying, we're not going to get shipped to Africa. That's not our country. This is our country. We built this country. So they're pushing back against colonization, as it was called. And they're saying, well, our right to live here is as good as the white man's and is incorporated in the Declaration of Independence. They go on to cite specific passages from the Declaration saying, this gives us the right to stay and the right to be equal and free along with everybody else. And then they also invoke this point about, we pledge ourselves in completing the revolution for human freedom commenced by the Patriots in 1776. And they're invoking there this idea that the Constitution wasn't, or the Republic wasn't fully formed when it was created. It's to use the founder's term, it's an experiment. It's a Republican experiment. It's ongoing. And they're going to be part of that effort to push and expand liberty. All right. Abraham Lincoln, when he gives his most famous address in 1863, the Gettysburg Address, says, what document is he going to invoke to give new meaning and power to the Civil War? He's going to invoke the Declaration of Independence, that all men, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So it goes on and on. Here's one you've never seen before. In 1876, the centennial of the nation, July 4th, 1876 to be precise, a labor organization in Chicago rewrote the Declaration of Independence and to serve their purposes as what they thought as exploited, oppressed workers in this new industrial setting. And so they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, life, liberty, and the full benefit of their labor. Now, what about the business section? Still a bit, there's definitely that business section there. It begins, it has deprived us of a living wage. It has forced us to pull our kids out of school and send them into mines and factories. It has, on and on. It's capitalism, or unrestrained capitalism, is the object of their indictment, right? Saying that that's the problem we face. There's a book you can buy or check out of a library, like such as this one, through the magic of interlibrary loan, which is a whole collection of these declarations of independence that are, different groups using this method. Here's one from Huey Long, who was a great populist in the 1930s, even more of a progressive than Franklin Roosevelt, and launched a campaign called the Share Our Wealth campaign. He was very popular until he was unfortunately assassinated. But when he's invoking like this why, what's the justification for saying that liberty isn't just about voting? Liberty is about living a decent life. And if you are living below the poverty, if you're working and you're below the poverty line and you can't feed your family, you're not a free citizen of a republic. There's a baseline, a material baseline that it must be met in order for people to be free. And he says, we're the richest country in the world. Did the founders mean that we should have today in America millions of children on the verge of starvation in a land that is overflowing with too much to eat? He obviously thinks not. And then in 1963, Martin Luther King gives his most famous address, 100 years after Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, and says in the I Have a Dream speech that I have a dream that we will live up to our creed. We will live up to that revolutionary creed that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So it's a thing that we can turn to make our claims on expanding liberty, expanding the definition of liberty, and this happened just in the last 10, 15 years. Here, leading the way was Massachusetts, marriage equality, right? If you're a gay American and you want the right to marry, you have to make your case for it. How is this not a radical, dangerous, claim? Well, they say, well, no, we should have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and our pursuit of happiness is marriage. There you go, right? So, and this has international significance. This is Ho Chi Minh. Why is Ho Chi Minh in my slide presentation? Because in 1945, at the end of World War II, when he rose up as the revolutionary leader of Vietnam and overthrew or sought to kick out the French, he wrote a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence that begins with these words: "All men are created equal." They are, it's a little bit tweaked from Jefferson's version, but it's the same thing, saying we're going to use this language of liberty to declare Vietnamese independence. If you saw the Ken Burns, 47-hour documentary on Vietnam, you know that's one of the great tragic things that's really well brought out. It's 18 hours, I think. Really well brought out in that documentary is how desperately that Ho Chi Minh wanted American aid and admired America. He lived in America for a good period of time. He used to wash dishes at the Parker House in Boston. So anyway, so that's turning point number one. And you'll start to see as we go through this that they will begin to overlap it a little bit, all right? So here's number two, intervention. The intervention concerns the Spanish-American War, which is, the little itty-bitty war at the end of the 19th century that doesn't seem to have all that, if you were to stack it up against World War II, World War I, Korea, Civil War, it wouldn't seem all that important, but it's monumentally important, as I will explain, all right? So, in order to explain why it's monumentally important, we have to sort of figure out what did it turn from? What did we turn from when we got involved in the splendid little wars it's sometimes called? Well, the basis of U.S. foreign policy up to the 1890s was a largely isolationist one. Not entirely, right? When we looked west, we didn't think isolation. We thought, let's go, right? We were perfectly willing to be non-isolationist, put it that way, when it came to westward expansion. But when the rest of the world, the founders believed this, and everybody agreed, stay the heck out of European affairs. It's a cesspool of intrigue and war, and republics are fragile, and therefore you've got to stay out of that stuff as much as possible. You have to sign a treaty now and again, but you've got to be very, very careful about getting involved in the world. All right, so there are two main points. One, why is this so? Why do we believe we have to stay out? Well, one is we believe that our best posture would not be to get involved in world affairs, but to stand out of world affairs and be a good example, so that people can see the wisdom of Republican liberty and a Republican society. So here's John Winthrop, who was not a Republican. He was a Puritan minister who, his birthday was just the other day. He delivers this famous sermon on the ship that's taking the first great community of people to what becomes Boston. And for him, they're going to build a Christian utopia. So he's invoking Christian utopian language here, saying, what we are about to build is going to be a city upon a hill, which is going to show we've become sick of the corruption and the distortion of Christianity in Europe. Now we're going to go to the New World. We're going to build a perfect Christian utopia. The Europeans are going to look across the Atlantic Ocean and say, oh my gosh, we've got to reform our ways. Look how far we've fallen from the truth. That was the plan. This idea of sort of being an example to the world religiously in the 19th century starts to become more of a secular ideal. There's definitely a little bit of one does not surpass the other, but in the 19th century, this idea of being a city upon a hill or a republic on a hill, it becomes paramount. Everybody talks about it. This is our goal for the world, is to turn the world Republican, small r, I hope I'm being clear on that, but to do so by example. And the best most vivid example of this is the Statue of Liberty. So, does anybody know what the Statue of Liberty's full name is? Like its real name? No, we call it the Statue of Liberty. It's Liberty Enlightening the World, right? So, well, there's a couple things. One is it's Liberty Enlightening the World. It has approximately zero to do with immigration. Nothing. When it unveiled it in 1886, the president was there, all kinds of dignitaries, everybody gave huge speeches, fireworks, millions of people, watching this great spectacle. One person mentioned immigration in the speeches that day, and it was to say we have to stop the riffraff from Europe coming to America, so, and communists and everything else. So it's an interesting thing about documents, right? The Declaration of Independence didn't mean any of these things that we just saw that we now say it means. And the Statue of Liberty did not mean anything about immigration or the huddled masses and all that stuff, but we ultimately read that meaning into it, right? We just said, sure, liberty. People coming from abroad, seeking liberty, why not? They happen to be passing right in front of the thing all the time. So Ellis Island is just a little blip away from that. But the whole point behind the Statue of Liberty is also that it faces Europe, right? It's not facing America, it's facing Europe. And the Statue of Liberty is basically saying, hey, Europe, you want some of this? You know, freedom, democracy, freedom of the press, free speech, upward mobility, no classes, at least we thought. And you know, all that, well then get rid of your kings and queens, get rid of your landed aristocracy, get rid of your fixed classes and your established churches, and get with the Republican, you know, become a Republican, and we'll cheer you on. So that's really the kind of message there, which we're going to transform the world, but not through gunboats and warfare and so forth. We're going to do it through example. All right, so that's point number one. Republicanize the world through examples, stay out of the world affairs. And the other is that foreign influence this may shock you, but they were really worried about foreign influence, particularly in our elections back in the late 18th century. And George Washington famously kind of codifies this in his farewell address. He warns us about all kinds of things, including factionalism and partisanship and so forth. But one of the biggest things he says, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, and I love that phrase, insidious wiles, right? The insidious wiles of Putin. We have to be constantly awake to that threat. Foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. So we have to be really careful about meddling in the world. You sign a treaty with a country and you think that's going to keep us safe, and then that country does something stupid, sucks you into a war, and your country begins to disintegrate. So that's Washington's warning is heeded, and it's widely believed. It's not just his own personal belief. And I could show you scores of examples, including John Quincy Adams, who said famously, America basically cheers on Republican movements in the world, but does not go off in search of monsters to destroy. It's a very famous line about how we need to be in the world, but we should not go off looking for wars, looking for foes to take on. And here's Grant, late 19th century, in his first State of the Union address. And he basically says, we sympathize with the people of the world struggling for freedom, for democracy, all that. We should abstain from enforcing our views upon unwilling nations, right? We're not going to tip nations, we're not going to do regime change, but we'll cheer you on, and private citizens will raise money, they do it all the time, for freedom movements in Hungary and in Ireland and everything else, but we're not going to get involved. All that changes in the 1890s. In the 1890s, we've gone from the 12th largest economy in the world in 1850 to the #1 economy in the world. And so we've got wealth, and we aspire to prestige, and we also have things we think we need to protect. So we're going to get involved in what I call imperialism, interventionism or imperialism light. And we could argue about that, but the best way to look at it is to see it in comparison to other countries. So if you look at one of the reasons why we seek to acquire territories beyond our borders, imperialism, is because everybody's doing it, right? This is all the European powers, particularly England, is carving up Africa, carving up parts of Asia, and we're fearful that we might get shut out of this opportunity. What if they carve up all of Asia and then say Americans can't trade there anymore? I mean, we'd be in a very difficult position. And you can see how this looks globally by 1914. So we get into the imperialism game late, and we get into it in a small way. We will find other ways to dominate the world. We realize that you could take over a country like India, or you could just use our wealth and our trade policy and things to acquire advantage. All right, a second category, military necessity. And this is linked to our economy. We want to be able to project our power out beyond our borders to keep us safe, but also keep commerce open. And you can't do that unless you have basically military bases out there in the Pacific, especially in the Pacific. The United States Navy, just to give you an idea, the United States Navy was the 12th largest in the world in 1880, and we began to build it rather substantially, so that by 1900 it's the 3rd largest Navy in the world. And so we're looking at the Pacific, saying, where could we make a naval base where we could have coal and water and food, just those 3 basic things, to keep our fleet out there in the ocean. And areas, there's a lot of islands in the Pacific Ocean, as we know. So that's where our eyes are fixed before we get involved in this war. By the way, this is another thing here that is worth pointing out, which is we talked about originalism and how it's a lovely idea that we should, only do what the founders wanted us to do, even though they said, go to it, do what you want. It's your world to live in. We're only going to be around a certain amount of time. But if you believe in originalism, one of the things you'd have to do after you took away the vote for women, after I could go on and on and on, is you'd have to dismantle the military down to 1%, 2% of what it is right now. I mean, literally down to nothing. Maybe, proportionally speaking, maybe 100,000 troops instead of 2 million. How many bases do we have around the world today? If George Washington knew that we had one base around the world, he'd have a heart attack. We have 800 bases around the world. 800 bases. So, and they make, you could make the argument that it's necessary, but it's certainly in violation of the original founders' ideals that a standing army. This is, where did Cromwell come from? Where does Napoleon come from? Where does Caesar come from? They're generals, and they essentially at a certain point say, you know what? I'm sick of this, representative government thing. I'm in charge, right? So that's the shorthand way of saying republics are doomed by big militaries because the military will eventually take over. Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled program. So turning point number 2. The other part about the other justifications of the economy, we now have a global economy. So you can see Singer Sewing Machine advertising the fact that they're selling their machines all around the world, which they are. Global trade and globalism and all is not a relatively recent thing. We are also idealistic. This is where we've taken our idea that we should be an example to the world, and we say, well, maybe when the time is right, we could get in there as the world's constable. That's Theodore Roosevelt. Intervening in wars, intervening in national disputes. Maybe we should use some of that power to make the world a better place. This is also the late 19th century, so it goes without saying that imperialism carries with it a certain racist set of ideas and motivations. And here you can see, I've used this image in my class, and I think there's at least on one occasion I've put this up on the screen, and that's all we talk about for the entire class, because it's just so loaded with ideas and points. But that's Uncle Sam, and this is after the Spanish-American War, so this is the newly acquired countries depicted as little children who are going to be can't have self-rule because they're not mature enough. So there's an implied idea that they might be able to self-rule at some point, but it's implied. All right, so what happens? Well, we've got, it all begins, all this theoretical notion that we should be more involved in the world becomes real when trouble begins in Cuba. Cuba is the last important colony in the Spanish Empire in this part of the world, and it's very valuable, and it's also symbolically valuable, but the Cuban people want their independence, just like we did, and guess what they quote to us as they seek their independence? Our Declaration of Independence, and they say, you guys should be the France to us, right? France allowed you to win your independence, you should help us out. So the Cuban people rise up, and the Spanish crush them, they rise up, they get crushed. And in the 1890s, they really begin to push for their independence, and this is when our media gets deeply involved in covering these stories, the yellow press as it's called, capturing these dramatic images and dispatches about Spanish atrocities, Spanish concentration camps, and so forth. It's exaggerated, but it's also, it's happening. It is a pretty brutal repression. And here you can see just 2 examples of the yellow press, which you could equally have called them the red press, but they're basically demanding the United States intervene in Cuba, and demanding the United States declare war on Spain and allow the Cuban people to rise up and to overthrow that oppression. Well, along the way, while tensions mount and there's pressure building in both Democratic and the Republican parties are slowly moving towards advocating Cuban independence. We sent one of our naval vessels down there, a relatively new one, parked it in Havana Harbor, and then it blew up. And of course, in that era, 260 sailors died. The conclusion of the yellow press was Spanish treachery, right? Spanish bombed the ship and killed all those American sailors. We now know from forensic work and excavations and things that the ship just blew up. Happened all the time. Steam-powered vessels. Does not take that much to. There were many examples in that time period. So you could argue that one of my unwritten 10 Commandments of history is nothing's new. I mean, here's fake news, 1898, if ever there was, right? And so the sinking in the Maine does not start the war. The war starts a couple months later, but it definitely starts to push. It becomes harder and harder for President McKinley to resist the call for war. And he declares war in the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, and then third, in defense of American interests, we will go to war. And so the war itself is the splendid little war. It only lasts a few months. Relatively speaking, every life is precious, but relatively speaking, it's not a particularly bloody war. It brings us Theodore Roosevelt. This is where he's reasonably well known as a rising political figure. This puts him on a direct path to the White House in just a couple of years. His exploits as the head of the Rough Riders, a regiment that he founded and then outfitted. Never went anywhere without a reporter on each side. So his exploits were covered and exaggerated. And in the end, we are suddenly, by the end of the summer of 1898, we are imperial power. We've acquired small but significant holdings around the world: Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. And many Americans oppose this. There's a whole powerful anti-imperialist movement led by Mark Twain and Jane Addams and many, many famous Americans. But the majority of Americans are pretty psyched, as this cartoon indicates, right? Chest thumping, the American eagle. We are now an empire 10,000 miles from tip to tip. So there's a lot of, we are now liking, we're in the club with the big, powerful countries of the world. And again, why does this matter? Just like with the Declaration of Independence, it matters because of what happens afterward, right? This idea of an idealistic intervention, that we're going to get into a war to save the world or save a people from tyranny, is going to be our go-to phrase. So in World War I, just a few years later, Woodrow Wilson doesn't say we need to go to war because Europe owes us hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in loans. He says we're going to go to war because we need to make the world safe for democracy. And then we even go so far as to nickname our army the Pershing's Crusaders, right? We're not just going into a war; it's a crusade. It's a virtuous crusade. World War II, and there are dozens of examples. But FDR saying we're going to play our honorable part in the great struggle to save our democratic civilization. The Korean War. We have done this. We've invaded Korea, said President Truman, because we know that what is at stake here is nothing less than our own national security and the peace of the world. President Johnson. Our purpose in Vietnam is to prevent the success of aggression. In this case, communist aggression from the communist North. And he goes on. He's very defensive here because he knows what people are going to accuse him of. He says it's not conquest, it's not empire, it's not foreign bases. It's just to do the right thing. Right? So we're not going to debate the merits of that, but it's just a way we frame our wars. The war in Kuwait, same thing. I mean, and if we're all old enough to have lived through 2001, 2002, 2003, how the most recent wars were framed and explained to us and gained national support, at least for a while, was this idea that it's the right thing to do. All right, now. I can't resist this little plug because if you're a podcaster, you get kind of obsessed about podcasts. So I'm just going to point one thing out, which is I'm always shocked when I ask a group like this. Like here you are on a Monday night in a windowless room, and it's kind of warm, listening to a history talk. So, I'm going to ask anyway. How many of you listen to podcasts? Yeah. So it's getting better, but still like just under a third. I would say it's like 28% of 28% of you. But you simply have got to make this your 2020 commitment. Right? Because you love NPR. Now, normally when I'm doing this one-day university, I say, you know what you're all missing right now? Everyone, it's usually like 10:30 on a Saturday, somewhere, Tucson or what have you. I see every one of you is missing Wait, Don't Tell Me. It really explodes with laughter because they are missing it. And I say, not anymore. You've got a purple button on your phone that literally says podcasts. And you just push that button, and then you just type in Wait, Don't Tell Me, and you push the button again, and boom, you've subscribed. There's no cost. And every Saturday, out of the sky, Wait, Don't Tell Me falls into your phone, and you can listen to Wait, Don't Tell Me on Tuesdays, while you fold the laundry, or Thursdays when you're on the treadmill. And there are 750,000 podcasts. Not all of them great, not all of them on topics you love, but if you like history, if you're interested in world religion, if you like true crime, if you're dealing with personal grief, if you are living with cancer, I mean, there are literally just enormous things, menu of things to listen to, and you can listen to it whenever you want to. So I'm giving you a New Year's resolution on January, whatever we are. Just walk up to a 14-year-old and say, "Honey, I would like to get some podcasts," and they'll do it for you, and you will be absolutely hooked. If you are a lifelong learner, an insatiably curious person. It is a, you will not believe how much there is out there. Okay.
What's the subject of Wait, Don't Tell Me?
Wait, Don't Tell Me is the NPR news, and it's humor, so it's like headlines from the day, sort of mock, a little trivia from the week. It's very funny. By the way, if any of you, Peter Sagal, I had my brush with greatness this summer was to shoot 4 history episodes with Peter Sagal. For Discovery Channel has a streaming service called Curiosity Stream. It's brand new, and so if you have Amazon Prime, you can get it. You can watch it. But there are 15-minute long episodes on Watergate, the Civil War, 2 other things. But anyway, it was kind of fun to work with Peter Sagal. All right, yeah, on-demand podcasting. There's the purple button. There's Wait, Don't Tell Me. Enough of that. All right, back to our third and final thing, the reformulation. So we have the declaration, the intervention, and the reformulation. And what do I mean by that? I could have picked many places to do this one. I just sort of pick it, at the early 20th century. But trying to figure out, as Jefferson and others pointed out, your world is going to change, and so you need to figure out, what rights there are, what rules there are, how you need to organize your society based on changing time and place. Jefferson and the others could not have imagined the world that existed by the 1890s. What kind of country we had become, technology, railroad, electricity, the phonograph, just to name a couple of things. And cities, New York City having, 4 million people by 1900, just unthinkable, in their minds. So and something called industrial technology, absolutely unthinkable. So let's talk a little bit about, let's sketch the background here. The late 19th century, it's called the Gilded Age. It's a time, it's gilded in the sense that it's a time of great wealth, unprecedented wealth generation in the late 19th century, but with some serious problems below the surface. So what are people worried about? It's just anxiety and optimism, sort of in tandem. They're anxious about rising poverty. And when I show this image, this never fails me, I say, what book would you associate with this image? Or what author? Charles Dickens, right? So it isn't. It's Harper's Weekly, the Time magazine of its day, front cover, 1876. And the artist, though, was trying to trigger your Dickens fears, right? Because up through 1876, Americans, in the 19th century, let's put it this way. In the 20th century, as you well remember, judging from everybody's age in this room, that our big fear in the 20th century was communism, and that people were, there was a certain set of people that always were saying that we are sliding towards communism. Communism is, we have to be very, very careful, very vigilant about, the communist threat. In the 19th century, it was Europeanism. Not ethnic Europeanism, but political Europeanism, by which I mean that we declared our status as a republic, but there's always that danger we're going to slide back towards aristocracy, slide back towards monarchy and inequality and all of that. So that's what this cartoon is trying to trigger in you, saying, oh my gosh, I thought we were not a nation of haves and have-nots. I thought we were a nation of equality, a nation of equal opportunity, a nation of, here we are and scenes of mass poverty in the 1870s really begin to disturb people. Harper's Weekly, 1876. Another one, big fear about rising power of big business. There was no such thing as big business in the late 1700s when the Constitution was drafted. And now, this will really shock you, as you can see from this. In the late 19th century, corporations had unbelievable power in Congress. They called the shots. The lobbyists, got their way. Thankfully, that's been fixed, right? You don't have to worry about that. Nothing is new. Here we are. Congress, this is the senators, and the giant money bag corporations are lording their power over them. They're coming through the entrance for monopolists. The people's entrance, which you'll have to trust me because that's what it says, is barred shut, says closed. So a real commentary on who's, our democracy is being corrupted by big business and being threatened by big business. Big business isn't in and of itself bad, but if it uses its power in this way, it is a threat to democracy. And there are specific individuals. This is John D. Rockefeller holding the White House, and in the background, he's turned the state, the nation's capital into an oil refinery. So he's the Standard Oil guy. Richest man on the face of the earth. And the point here is that, and this is something that the founders would have been really concerned about, is that there's no way to control John D. Rockefeller, right? He's the richest, most powerful man in the world, not just in America, and he's beyond the reach of democracy. There's nothing to control him and to control him from doing what he wants to do. To running his business the way he wants to do, smashing his competitors, bribing state legislatures and so forth. There's nothing to stop him from, to hold him back. And the caption is great. What a strange little government, right? He's just like basically saying, as I go about, dominating the world, the government is like not even a speed bump. It's just, just not there. I don't have to worry. That's one thing I don't have to worry about. All right, hold that thought. Rising anxiety over increasing inequality. We've never thought of ourselves as an equal society, but a society where inequality was much, much less extreme. And in 1890, it was true. They weren't imagining it. The top 1%, this is where you start to hear the phrase, the 1% for the first time, in any kind of meaningful way. They owned more than half of all the nation's wealth. And another way to look at that, to look at that pie is that 44% of Americans owned only 1.2%. So it's extremes of wealth that we've never seen before. And people saying it's, here we are we becoming that landed, that a nation of, there's an aristocracy that's going to control everything, and the rest of us are going to have to, grind out a living like a Russian serf. Okay, and then rising fear over labor capital conflict. So here's an image from the Haymarket bombing of 1886. Between 1881 and 1900, there were 37,000 strikes. If you went from 1776 to 1881, there were probably 500 strikes. And then suddenly, strikes all the time. Huge national railroad strikes in which 100 people are killed by the police or the militia or sometimes federal troops. And then small strikes at a local manufacturing. But just huge numbers and a lot of these are incredibly contentious, and many of them do become violent. And again, when Americans think class conflict and social upheaval, they don't think New York. They think Paris. They think Germany. They think that's a European thing. We don't have those problems, and now suddenly we appear to. So this fear of creeping Europeanism is on people's mind. So what to do? It's widely believed in the late 19th century that we have to do something, but the answers are where people disagree, right? About whether we should, how do we rein in these problems and maintain our democracy and maintain capitalism? How do we thread that needle, So now this sounds super wonky, so just hang in there. But the decision among key people is that we need to reformulate the Republican notion of the state. I know that sounds so boring. But all it means is, I'll explain. So the traditional Republican notion of the state, the government, is that power is the number one threat to liberty. So when you go back and read what people said in the 1770s and 1780s, power was corrupting. Government power was corrupting. The king was the best example of it. So when we created our republic, we created decentralized power scheme, and also term limits and everything else. We made sure, and checks and balances. We were really paranoid about government power, and so the state has to be kept weak. In 100 plus years later, in the 1890s, and this is actually happening all across the industrialized world, not just in the U.S. The agreement is that power is still the number one threat to liberty, but power is no longer, the greatest source of power is no longer the state, it's big business. It's a total new world in which we live. John D. Rockefeller is, the great power threat. And so, the thing we feared, the state, has to be strengthened. Right here, the state must be kept weak to keep us free. Now we say, no. We actually have to make the state a lot stronger to regulate big business and other things in order to maintain our democracy. So it's a profound shift, but it's made so because of the changing context in which we live. All right, so we know this is called the progressive era. The late 19th, early 20th century. It doesn't begin on any particular date, and there's no set of single ideas or individuals, though there are a couple of common ideals. And Roosevelt is not the only progressive. In some ways, he's not even all that progressive, but he becomes the face of it, and he pushes for progressive ideals from the White House, so they gain a lot of traction. One of the things that he pushes for, again, not as much as many people would wanted him to, but he makes a really powerful case. Like, why people say, you can't do this. The government has no right to regulate business. And he says, of course it does. Great corporations or trusts are the creatures of the state. The corporation, Standard Oil, does not exist in the natural world. We wrote it up on a piece of paper and said there's a thing called a corporation. And it means this, and it means this, and it means this, and you can do this, and you can do that. You can't do this. And we created it on a piece of paper. You know, corporation is a fiction that we all agree on. And therefore, the state not only has the right to control them, has the duty to control these institutions, not destroy them, not seize them, you know, as socialists might want them to, but to control them in the name of the people. That's the argument being made by progressives like Roosevelt. And there are two justifications for it. One is that we often allow our reverence for individualism, which we should have reverence for. It is one of those distinct American values. But we often lose sight of the fact that it's not the only American value. That the other value that's in tension with it is the common good. And we live right now in 2020 in an era where individualism, you know, if you asked, you know, any number of people what's the, you know, the most important American value, a lot of people would say individualism. And they would say it's really the only value that matters. That's why we have this rebirth of libertarianism. I could go on such a tangent right now, but I'm not. But the founding fathers believed in individualism. They also believed in the common good, the things that hold us together, the things that are important for the whole, and that these things are their intention. So the hard work of a republic is figuring out how to have maximum individualism while also maintaining the common good. I mean, you want the individual entrepreneur to be able to, you know, create that factory and create those goods, but if he's pumping toxins into the river or into the air or both, he's destroying the common good, right? Our common air, our common water supply is being destroyed by that person's actions. So how do we resolve that? That's really what it comes down to. The answer how we do it is through government regulation, right? We're going to empower the state to have a little more authority, and we'll argue about how much authority. And that this idea of laissez-faire, this idea that the government should be completely out of, you know, hands off of business, hands off of private property, that is replaced by an idea that the government should do the least amount of damage or intervention possible, but it has to intervene. It has to do something to control these private interests. Otherwise, we're going to be an oligarchy before long. All right. And one way to look at it, this is where you see a direct intersection between our first and third points, which is, this is John Mitchell, one of the great labor leaders of the early 20th century. And he says, while the Declaration of Independence established civil and political liberty, right? All those early ideas of liberty, liberty meant voting, liberty meant, you know, representation, liberty meant, you know, ability to stand before a jury, all those things. John Mitchell says it established those things, bravo, but it did not establish industrial liberty because we weren't an industrial power, industrial society back then. We are now in an industrial society. We need to establish industrial liberty, which he goes on to say is, you know, there's a material quality to it. He says if you work, he is not really free who is forced to work unduly long hours for wages so low that he can not provide for the necessities of life for himself and his family. So if you are working for 50, 60 hours a week and your family is starving, you're not free. You're not a full Republican citizen. So there's a baseline that we need to have there. All right, and that increasingly becomes a widely accepted idea. People argue about what the baseline needs to be. All right, one good example of this common good progressivism at work under Teddy Roosevelt is the Great Coal Strike of 1902. The country ran on coal, so just imagine a telecom strike. You know, if Verizon and all the other companies had a big strike, you know, everything was shut down, right? Because of how digital our economy is. Well, everything ran on coal in those days. So the coal strike of 1902 really threatened not just business, but people's well-being, particularly during the winter. And so the traditional way in which the government responded to railroad strikes or big strikes like coal strikes was send in the military and 100 people die and the strike gets crushed. You know, that's what happened in, you know, the railroad strikes of the late 19th century. And Theodore Roosevelt says, that's absurd. Why would we send the military in to kill American citizens when intelligent, well-meaning people on both sides can sit down at a table and work this out? So he calls the mine owners and says, come to the White House. And he says to the mine, you know, union operators, you know, organizers, come to the White House. And they sit down at the table at the White House and they literally work out a deal where you give a little, and 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 the coal strike is averted. And it's a great example of using that power of government and the power of you know, the presidency to intervene in a private dispute in the name of the common good. Everybody benefited from the aversion of that strike. And we could go on forever and ever and ever about the progressive era and all the many ways in which it, changed the way our relationship with the government and the ways in which it, consumer protection. I mean, just think about consumer protection, right? In a free market, you should be able to decide where you want to buy your meat, right? But if your family all dies from food poisoning, you surely will not buy meat from that person anymore. But it wouldn't have been nice if your family didn't die from meat, food poisoning, because that guy had meat inspection, had to sell meat that had been inspected by a government inspector. So that's the idea in action. You can see that this is just scratching the surface. We could go on and on. And of course, I could have done this point with the other Roosevelt in the 1930s in the New Deal, but they're related. New Deal is sort of the next phase of this kind of expansion of the government. And Social Security probably being the best example of something that fundamentally changes the orientation of citizens to the federal government. But there's many others. Okay, 3 turning points: the Declaration, the intervention, and the reformulation. So we end there, although I always end with my James Baldwin quote, because I think it's one of the great quotes about history. Basically, history isn't just cool, fun stories, right? History has to have some meaning now. And that's what James Baldwin says here. History does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It's just like, why do we have to, how are we ever going to understand the racial conflict in America? It's not just about, like listening to what both sides say, right? It's knowing the long history behind those conflicts. And the list is endless of things that we would be informed, greatly informed by our, knowing a lot more about history. Because, Isabel Wilkerson, who's a great writer, wrote a prize-winning book called The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. She was on a podcast, and she was interviewed she was trying to explain what the book was. A little bit of biography, it was a little bit of sociology, a little bit of psychology, but mostly it was history. And she said that's the most important part, the history. And she had this great way of putting it. She said, if you go to the doctor with an ailment, the doctor doesn't just say, "Oh, your chest hurts," and write you a prescription. The doctor says, "Whoa, wait a minute. Fill out some paperwork here." Not the insurance kind, information kind. Tell me about your medical history. Tell me, what's happened to you. Do you have what ailments have you already had diagnosed? Page 2. Tell me about your parents' medical history. Who had the heart attack, and who had cancer, and who had whatever it might be. Even better, page 3. Tell me about your grandparents' medical history. And after you tell me, after I read your history, your medical history, then and only then can I make an informed decision about what kind of medication, what kind of procedure you might need. And just think about how, her point was, that's how history has that power to help us. It doesn't give us an exact message, but it gives us the power to figure out how to solve our own problems in our own times. We're not going to solve things unless we know the longer story behind them. Thank you all very much. All right, so I don't know when they throw us out, but I'm happy to take any questions. I also know it's really warm in here, so stand up. Do whatever you got to do. You're not going to be distractions, so just don't worry about that. Does anybody have any questions?
Sure.
Yep.
Since you are an Irish historian, what are your thoughts about the Irish Potato Famine and the duty of the monarch to his subjects?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, if you were in my Irish American experience class, the first thing we would do is we'd say, don't call it the potato famine. It's more of a picky point in the sense that just saying, famines are not caused by scarcity of food. They're not. They're caused by a government or a powerful body depriving people of food or failing to get food to people, whether it's intentional or not. So that's just one of those kind of make you think points. My students would all have twitched when you said potato famine. But that's the big question. One of the big questions about the famine in Ireland in the 1840s. Ireland had crop failure, potato crop failures many times, including some pretty big ones in the past. But the big one, which everybody had predicted, starts in 1845, and in the course of 5 years, about a quarter of the Irish population flees to other places, including America, mostly to America, and another quarter dies. So it's a remarkably devastating famine. And people say, well, what did the English government do? Because Ireland is an English colony, essentially, controlled by the British government. And people say, well, maybe in modern times we would expect the government to do something, but that's not what they really did. Well, a lot of scholars have looked at it and said, well, England spent money when it needed to, right? In just a few years before the famine, England decided to abolish slavery in the kingdom, in the empire, and did so by compensating all the slaveholders. Basically, wrote tens and tens of millions of dollars in checks to buy them out of their slaves, to the tune of like 40 million pounds or some staggering sum of money. So England was prepared to spend money, when in times of crises. But not in Ireland, essentially. It's a complicated story, but there was, the principal government in charge said, Irish people are lazy, and we cannot just give them food, because it'll make the laziness and the improvidence of the Irish people worse. So we will either give them nothing, or we'll make them work for their food, and it's a whole long story behind that. But in retrospect, you can see that a lot more could have been done, and that there were examples where the British government did in other places. Or, as somebody else put it, if there had been a famine or a collapse of crops in England proper, you better believe nobody would have starved, right? But across the way, it wasn't the urgency just was not there. Another way to put it is there's never been a famine in a democracy. India had famines over and over and over again as an English colony. India gained its independence, has never had a famine since, right? Because it's a democracy, and people just won't stand for that kind of inaction on the part of the government. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, not really, because what I was alluding to is the legacy of that is embodied in our own culture, and it's a controversial issue about what does the sovereign, in this case, our government, owe its people.
Yeah, I mean but in the case of Ireland, it's odd because Ireland had a little bit of democratic representation, right? Within representation in Parliament on a small scale, and theoretically they were the subjects of the crown, right? So in that case, arguing from traditional English law, the crown should have done everything in its power to stop the suffering, but didn't. So, anybody have another question? About anything?
I wasn't a plant, by the way.
Yep.
So I'm looking at your weaving of history, and it's all driven by male thought. And early on, if women had been involved, we've seen this take a different path.
Well, it's what they train us in graduate school to say is, well, that's counterfactual, right? Because women weren't in charge. But I think yesterday was Alice Paul's birthday. Alice Paul, the great women's rights advocate, and she has a great line that says, there never will be a new world order unless women are part of it. And then she has a couple of variations on that, basically saying the world is as screwed up as it is today because women have not been part of the power structure. So I would say certainly things would have gone differently. Exactly, you can over-romanticize that and say this is, say that women are because they're pure. And selfless. This is the argument that was made for the vote, right? About 100 years ago, saying women should get the right to vote.
It didn't work 100 years ago.
Yeah. So we know from Game of Thrones and everything else that women sometimes can be just as terrible as men. But I think without question, I mean, in the same way that our politics have changed, whenever we've included a new group, our politics and our society has changed dramatically. It's also produced an incredible pushback every time. Anybody, did you have a question?
I was just curious, do you have a website where you list all the other 48 changes?
Yeah, so if you go to edwardtodonald.com, you'll see where it says great courses, and you click on that and it'll show you the two courses that I did. One on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, one on the 48 Turning Points, and then it lists like a table of contents. Yeah, so,
great.
All right. And the great courses is, I shouldn't say this, it's going to be on TV, but it's expensive, but you're the interlibrary loan, you can get to that thing for nothing in like 3 days. You can watch them on DVD, or you can listen to them on CD too. They also come as audio. So it's and for $10 a month. Talk about Netflix for nerds. $10 a month, you can get great courses streaming. You get 8,000 lectures on everything from world religion to turning points in American history, 30-minute lectures, unlimited. Just as, you know, and they cover everything. It's an amazing, so you can pay for it or you can just one-by-one interlibrary loan it. You could buy them too. I do have student loans to pay. For lovely children. Yep, put all the way in the back.
What are in thinking about the three, both me, my wife, and other people I talk to, reflexively, the Civil War is almost the first thing that comes up. Why wasn't the Civil War one of the three?
Yeah, this is where we get into that question of weight and matters. So when I did the 48 turning points, which covers everything. You know, the invention of the television, you know, like a whole wide range of things. When I first started doing this for the one-day university, they said do 5. So the 5 were what was the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's where we got the Civil War, the intervention, and the 5th was the personal computer. You know, so a little bit of technology. So yeah, implied in this talk was that the Civil War as it went in its unpredictable course, Lincoln others invoked abolitionists invoked the Declaration of Independence to help get us to the point of a civil war, not intentionally so, and then during the Civil War, that language of liberty is applied to the idea, the decision to abolish slavery. So it's there. It's not less direct. But yeah, that's a fair point. You know, why not the Civil War? Anybody have any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Down, we got 45 to go. So a couple of things. We are here as guests of the Westboro Public Library. So if you